I'm really delighted and honored to welcome everyone to this, this discussion hosted by the Posthumanism Research Institute. And I'm going to begin by saying that we're looking today at the idea that we're moving beyond the idea that humans are central. We're contemplating post-human pedagogies as entangled, interconnected, and shaped by places, temporalities, situated immaterialities, cultures, and animated entities that impact teaching, learning, and scholarship. So I'm going to begin by welcoming Katie Strom and Shaknoza Kayumova. I'm going to quickly go over bios and then invite them to begin talking. Dr. Kayumova is Associate Professor in the Department of STEM Education and Teacher Development at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, a research scientist at the, is it Kaput, Shaknoza? The Kaput Center for STEM Education, Research and Innovation, and founder of the STEAM Learning, Language and Identity Research Lab. Dr. Kayumova's research closely examines the ways STEM education could be a context for empowerment and positive science identity development and the development of linguistically and ethnically and racially diverse learners, increasing representation of people of color in STEM fields. Katie Strom is Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at California State University, East Bay, Director of CSUEB Center? CSUEB Center for Research on Equity and Collaborative Engagement, and co-founder of the Posthuman Research Nexus, which is a global organization that supports and connects scholars engaging in posthuman and other complexity perspectives. Dr. Strom's research combines multiple critical and complex neo-materialist theories to study teacher learning and practice, particularly in support of minoritized youth, as well as to advocate more broadly for relational difference, affirmative ways of thinking, being, doing in education and academia. I'm now going to hand over to Katie and Shaknoza to begin our event today. I'm turning off my microphone, but I'll go like this when you've got 5 minutes. So let's see what the time is, 12:04. So over to you, and thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you so much, Fiona. So I will get us started here, and you'll have to forgive me. This is the first time that I'm using this technology. So let me see if I can get this started with the presenter view. Okay, oh, excellent. So today, my colleague Shaknoza Kayumova and I will be talking about moving towards a pluriversal praxis in science education. And so we really start with the idea that the persistence of inequities for Black and Brown youth in science is at least partially because science education in the United States is based on Western colonial ways of knowing and being, or ontology and epistemology. And so this thinking is characterized by a specific set of orientations that then translates into the classrooms. And so here I have this chart that sort of lays out what some of these characteristics are, starting with the notion of binary or either or, so operating by separation or by hierarchy. And what this translates into is a foregrounding of epistemology and separating it from ontology, right? So not understanding the connection between knowing and being, and hierarchizing humans over nature. Another really important characteristic here is the notion of extra-human causality. And so basically what that does is it looks at natural causality as assigning who gets to be human, right? And so assigning it, God gets to decide, or science decides, or economics decides, right? The invisible hand of the market determines who gets to have access to healthcare, right? So this idea that supernatural or extra-human powers are agents in determining who gets to be human. There's a centering of individual humans, which are defined by the bios only. And so individual humans are considered to be the basic unit of reality and the only form of agentic life. And so what that does is again, that separation of humans from systems, from nature, and it naturalizes the European version of the human as defined by white, male, Eurocentric, and dominant identities. Also central here is the notion of sameness, essentialism, or Deleuze and Guattari say the one that becomes two, a universal orientation, the notion that the world is fixed and stable, unchanging. And so then that translates into a reproduction of hegemonic thought and an imposition of that hegemonic thought or knowing being as the correct and only way. And then finally, and very important for science, is the notion of objectivity and neutrality, transcendence and representationalism as, you know, characteristics of the world. And so what that translates into is no need for axiology or ethics, right? This idea that humans can create objective truths that can apply to everyone. And I will hand it over to my colleague Shaknoza to discuss the consequentialities of these ways of knowing and being.
So my colleague Katie and I've been studying how these consequentialities actually play themselves out in day-to-day education, teaching and learning, and how can we make them visible in order to be able to tackle with them? How do we visibilize the ways in which this certain type of human-centered ways of knowing and being in the world actually perpetuates itself, and how does it then causes certain kind of inequities or consequentialities, both for humans, non-humans, or more than human entities. So some of the consequentialities that we want to mention here today are, for instance, it erases non-Western scientific contributions, right? There is this historical erasure of a science, or what it means to do science or to be a science person, that especially from indigenous communities, that have been erased in the process of what we today see as a work of science, which traces the version of science history that locates all scientific contribution to the Western world. Next, it imposes narrow understanding of science, which values linear, neutral, objective view of science as the only correct way to participate in the discipline and demand assimilation. I akin this to this famous story of at least in the United States, of Wizard of Oz, right? Like, you know, there is always a researcher, there is always a human behind any kind of knowledge production. And yet, right, we attribute to knowledge this objectivity, this view from nowhere and neutrality, which then actually perpetuates the idea that what we see is the ultimate capital T truth, right? It takes away from the idea that these are knowledge produced. So what happens next is that this reproduces dominant way of thinking about the world. For instance, in the context of education, right, teachers and students they tend to think in binaries. We get subjected and become subjectified to actually thinking in binaries, in hierarchies, in fixities, and homogeneous entities without connection to co-contextual, sociocultural, or political things that actually take place in our own being or in our own decisions or grounds for our decisions. Next, it reproduces this hegemonic pedagogies that we often feel ourselves in our bodies, or we end up actually reinforcing or reproducing, thinking that's the right way of doing, which reinforces unequal power relations. Teachers hold knowledge or determine the modes of meaning and expression, and it leaves a little room for inquiry or connection or relationality to the ways in which the knowledge or being in the world actually offers itself to us, or to the entities that are around us that actually help us to think in certain way or be in certain way, right? It centers the human and the agency of the human as the ultimate thing. And whenever there is whenever there is anything that doesn't go according to the ways in which we plan things to go, it again attributed to the human agency, which reduces deficit perspective, reinforces these unequal power relations in which, you know, people who are unable to do certain things or unable to achieve, right, quote unquote achieve, or students who are unable to achieve, then they are positioned at a deficit, at lacking resources, lacking agency, lacking something, which then ends up in all kinds of learning exclusions, where students are excluded from participating in knowledge construction or new knowledge constructions, which also then has implications in the ways in which all kinds of differences and identities are being excluded or being marginalized or being reproduced. Katie, back to you.
Thank you so much. So to disrupt these harmful deficit perspectives, these consequentialities that Sheknaza just went over, we join many educational scholars, you know, from the post-human community, but also you know, indigenous scholars, Black feminist scholars, post-colonial scholars, scholars from the global South, that have been calling for us to engage in diverse critical onto-epistemologies for some time. And so we're advocating for, again, we're sort of conceptualizing it as a set of shifts. So moving from that binary or, you know, separated hierarchical linear perspective that separates out ontology and epistemology, and moving to onto epistemology, right? This more relational notion of interdependence. Deleuze-Guattari call it immanence. So it's the and perspective. So connection and proliferation. And again, you know, moving away from the notion of extra-human causality as God or science or economics, something other than the human getting to decide who is human, right? So instead, we are taking responsibility. And here we are bringing in axiology, right? The ethics piece, saying it is an ethical imperative that we are critical and accountable, and actually pointing out the paradox here of, on the one hand, not claiming any agency for these underlying perspectives that translate into material harm, and instead pointing to natural causality, pointing to science, pointing, you know, to so-called objective thought, while at the same time saying that the human is the only, you know, entity on earth with agency. So really calling that out, and instead saying we have to be grounded, we have to be accountable. And related to that, in moving from the notion that individual humans are only defined by the bios, moving to the idea that we are connected up to multiple systems, right? We are entangled with nature, and we share agency, right, across that nature-culture spectrum. And so assemblages or systems with shared agency, that's the main unit of reality, not the individual human. And then moving from the notion of sameness and essentialism and universalism and fixity, moving to difference and heterogeneity and pluriversality. So here we bring in the concept of pluriversality, which comes from the Zapatistas of Chiapas. And their definition translates to a world in which many worlds fit. So really embracing heterogeneity and infinitude of legitimate and valuable ways of knowing and being in the world. And with that, always knowing that we're always changing, we're always becoming different, right? So difference becomes the natural state of the world. And then finally, pushing back on notions of objectivity and neutrality and transcendence and representationalism, the idea that there could ever be a one-to-one correspondence, and moving to a more situated, political, affective, material orientation to the world. And so in the piece that we draw this presentation from, we look at entry points into working with teachers to shift to these diverse critical onto-epistemologies. And so over the next few slides, we're going to talk on multiple levels at what it might look like to take these, notions that can be pretty abstract and put them into practice. And so I'm going to pass it back over to Shaknoza to talk us through these.
Thank you, Katie. So whenever we talk about this idea of political ontology, right, where the plurality comes from or sits in, many of our colleagues as well as teachers, they ask us question, okay, they say, we understand ontology is important. We understand it's in epistemology is important. Question number one, how is it different than the political epistemology of the feminist women and situated knowledges that the feminist women have been talking about? How is it different, right? How is it different from the intersectional or the assemblage idea of the things? And the first response to that is that onto-epistemological or political ontology situates itself as a unit of analysis at the ontological level. It's not at the epistemological level. Epistemology is the byproduct of our ontologies, right? So really, analysis is unit of analysis of ontology. Then the next question we are asked as often is, by teachers, by teacher candidates, how do we bring these ideas that are really complex into real curriculum, into real teaching and learning? How do we talk about them, or how do we even conceptualize this? So in the last couple of years, we've been really working with teachers to explore the ideas of pluriversality and political ontology and really look back at the curriculum in the context of the United States. The curriculum is often mandated by the states, it's mandated by the standards. So what we did, we took one of those standards, right, and took the ways in which traditionally things are done and decided to rework it from this political ontological perspective of the pluriversality. So here is we took the concept of osmosis. It's a scientific concept that's taught in schools. And we looked at how it's taught from standards perspective and how it's ontologically defined in the current science, right? So osmosis, it's a conceptual definition and learning goals that precede it. So it's a process by which molecules of a solvent tend to pass through a semi-permeable membrane from a less concentrated solution into a more concentrated one, right? So the teachers took this very linear, very objective, neutral, right? Like very truth-oriented kind of, with the capital T definition, and then reworked it from a relational, interconnected, ethical, political, and more than human perspective of ontology. So then osmosis becomes something that is a dynamic process. At the ontological level, we redefine the concept, right? It's a dynamic process of exchange and reciprocity between entities, right? It's human, non-human, and more than human entities. And these entities are, quote unquote, living beings with their own agency and intelligence, right? They have developed intelligence for centuries. They have developed their agencies for centuries and figured out how to help one another, how to coexist in this world or co-create this world in order for it to be able to flourish and thrive. Right now, since we've ontologically redefined osmosis, now, how does it look when it comes to enactment in the classroom? So here is one example that the teacher took this idea in the enactment, right? Instead of asking, so water plays a very important role in the process of the osmosis. So the teacher is, instead of objectifying the water, right, or looking at water as a less than human, the teacher decided to actually give this personify water and saying, what are the water's superpowers, right? And then start to list all the kind of superpowers that we students know that the waters have. Here we have only a couple examples because, for the sake of the presentation. So it keeps the living things alive. It makes rain. It needs for photosynthesis. And there was a long list of things that the water as a superpower participates with an agency to make the life possible in this world, right? And then here's an example from a student who were looking at how eggs were taking water in or participating in the osmosis process, where they call the eggs eggstein. So they personified the little eggs that are not even invisible to the naked eye as an eggstein, right? And they talk about what happens to the eggstein when there are environmental degradations, such as when humans actually put salt into on the roads. For instance, this is a case here in the northeastern United States. In the winter time, the roads are salted due to the weather, and then that salt ends up on the ground in the water, right? Which actually then is very harmful to all the living organisms. So students decided to look at how these human interventions actually participates or intervene with the osmosis. And this student was looking at what happened to the eggstein. Again, eggs, you cannot even see the eggstein with a naked eye, right? Like, it's a very small organism, very small egg. What happens to him when his in this case eggstein, they are exposed to the salted water that was a human intervention.
Do you want me to take this one?
Sure.
Okay. So then finally we went down to the micro level with the discursive, and this also is actually an activity that we've done with practicing teachers in terms of how do we make that shift. And so here we've taken 3 different science tasks. As we're looking at, for example, making meaning of a phenomenon, giving directions for an activity, and activating student knowledge, and actually taking, asking teachers to say, what would be a directive statement, where it would be an individual activity that we are telling students to do, versus moving to a more collectivist framing. So again, that sort of, fostering that relational orientation. So for example, in terms of making meaning, when we're asking students to think about and make meaning of how water travels from the bottom of the stem to the flower of a plant. So a more directive statement would be, can you explain how water travels to the flower of a plant? But a more collectivist reframing, and again, these were ones that teachers came up with. Science team, let's use what we saw in our osmosis experiments this week to design an experiment to discover how water gets to the flower of a plant. So using more collectivist language here, and making it that joint co-constructed activity. And sort of the same for the second 2 examples, right? For the second one, the direction, watch this video, then draw this picture, right? And then the collectivist reframing also provides, quite a bit more language to engage with as well. We were working with teachers around working with multilingual learners as well. We have this egg, some vinegar, a cup, and corn syrup. Okay, science team, let's create an experiment together that makes sense of how a cell membrane works. So it's also posing it as an inquiry, right? Activity that people are engaging in together, right, as a team.
And I think what's important to talk about here, because there is still this language of experimentation. What happens behind the scenes is that to make sense of the process of osmosing using this pluriversal onto epistemology, teachers looked at it how traditional knowledge systems conceptualize the movement of the substance between the different entities. In many non-Western knowledge systems, right, and this is where the political ontology comes in. The natural world is seen as interconnected and sacred, with all living and non-living elements existing in a complex web of relations, right? This idea of assemblages. This means that the movement of the substances between different entities is often seen as a reciprocal process where each entity is both giving and receiving in equal measures. So one way of then conceptualizes looking at osmosis as a process is a process of reciprocity between the two entities. In this view, osmosis is not simply a physical process of water moving across semi-permeable membrane, but rather dynamic exchange of energy and nutrients between entities. So in many indigenous knowledge systems, plants are seen as living beings with their own agency and intelligence, or these rocks or the sun, these human and non-human entities are seen as with their own agency and intelligence. They are believed to have the ability to communicate with others, other plants, other animals, other entities, to exchange knowledge, to exchange substance, to exchange nutrients with their surroundings in order to thrive. So understanding, for instance, concepts such as osmosis through these pluriversal onto epistemologies allows us to view it as a holistic process that's embedded in a larger systems of relationship and reciprocity. And by recognizing the interconnectedness of all entities in natural world instead of human-centeredness, we can gain a deeper appreciation of complex processes that sustain life on Earth and how we are just part of that one small assemblage.
So in conclusion, just to wrap up very quickly, some of the key sort of ideas that we talked about in the beginning, it's really important for us to remember and to think about the ways that traditional science logics construct anything outside of those dominant identities, white, male, and human, as less than, while obscuring it with that objectivist, neutral view, right? And that, when translated into science classrooms, that matters for our students. It matters for our students because it perpetually constructs them at a deficit, which, as Shaknoza discussed earlier, has real consequentialities for their learning, for teaching, for learning, and for their access to science identities. So making this more complex and pluriversal onto epistemological shift, again, it really helps us move to that place so we can speak and act from this place where things are interconnected and relational, right? And understanding that we are entangled, we are bound up with, we are implicated in injustices, right? Just as much as they're contributing to our own states of being. And so the last few slides have showed some of the ways that we've worked with educators to engage with these diverse onto epistemologies so that we can create more expansive, more heterogeneous views of STEM and STEM curriculum and teaching and learning and put those to work. So thank you so much. And this again comes from, and of course, many more references from the ideas in this paper, which again, we need to honor many, educational scholars from multiple fields, across posthumanism and feminisms and the new materialisms and indigeneities and Black feminisms and postcolonial and scholars from the global South. So you'll find all of those references in this paper, Ontology, Epistemology, and Critical Theory in STEM, which is from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Education, and I will drop the link in the chat as well. So thank you so much. And Shaknoza, did you want to say anything in closing? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was very gripping and beautiful. I wonder if we could just give you a round of applause quickly. Thank you so much. I know we don't have a huge audience today, but this will go onto the PRI website for dissemination and viewing. I'm wondering if there are any questions that are coming up or any comments. I certainly love the idea of, oh, I see there's a oh, there are 26 folks attending the live stream. Okay. I didn't know that, Christine. I can only see us. So that's very good to know. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. One of the constructs that resonated with me, of course, the sense of and connectedness, but is the idea of pluriversality and multiple worldings. I really enjoy the work of Kathleen Stewart around worlding moments, and so perhaps this is something that has kind of crept into your work via osmosis as well, scholarly osmosis, which is going on a great deal in our thinking together. I see that Christine has raised a hand. Christine, will you speak? Because actually, if anybody else wants to speak, I have no idea. I can't see other participants.
Yes,
so,
I am monitoring. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes. Would you like to take over and moderate the if anyone wants to ask a question? Perhaps Agnosa could respond to mine, and then we can talk for a few minutes until 12:40 or so.
I just wanted to say first that folks who are attending via live stream can ask their questions in the chat box, and I do have some questions coming in, so I can relay them to the panel members. And I do have 4 already, so turn to me when you're ready, Fiona.
Okay. Well, I asked for a comment on worlding, and you can leave that and go straight to the other questions if you wish, or you can comment on that. Completely up to you.
So I have a question from Charlotte who says, that was so good, thank you. I was interested to find out if there was any kind of, any kickback from teachers, or as she says, perhaps a better phrase, how receptive were educationalists to the shifts you conceptualize?
So in the beginning, so we've been working with a group of teachers, and in the beginning, these ideas were not well received. And I don't want to say that the idea of pluriversality wasn't well received. The teachers are all on the board that they want to, they want equity, they want better education for all students, right? I think intention-wise, all teachers are on the same board. However, when it comes to really problematizing the very grounds on which we stand as a discipline, right? And then how this discipline has been really defining part of our own identities, it's very natural to receive in the beginning not be so receptive to these ideas, right? Because the teachers became science teachers, but they probably have made connections to science in ways that also wrapped up and entangled with their own identities. So the first couple sessions that we had, we actually set it up as a sense making, where we tried to make sense of these ideas together. And we were all at the different stages of the sense making, right? But eventually working throughout the year, I believe that then we started to coming to our own way of understanding what it means to enact pluriversality, what it means to enact political ontology, or be aware of the ethical and political grounds of our actions, in our own ways. So it's not about replicating one idea where everybody is the same, but actually seeing the different ways of taking up these ideas by different teachers who come from different backgrounds, who work with different students, who work in different contexts, and being sensitive and cognizant as well as responsive to see those differences. I think that's been really a turning moment in terms of everybody being willing to listen to others and being willing to also speak up and being willing to try new things, right? To me, that's a definition of pluriversality, where we know that there are multiple worlds within each one of us, right? And it's okay for each one of us to come at things in ways that is not damaging or is not putting anyone else or anything else as less than in our interactions.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also emphasize, again, Shaknoza was talking about the notion of ethico-political consciousness, and it's just so important that we help teachers develop that alongside any kind of pedagogies that we're talking about. Particularly in terms of, the United States, 80% of our teachers are white. Most of them are monolingual, and they have very deeply entrenched deficit perspectives. And so the development of that ethico-political piece alongside, understandings of scientific inquiry and pedagogy, it's just absolutely essential. They have to understand the harm that's being done. And so I also have found in some additional work, actually one of my dissertation students, looking at working with science teachers to develop asset-based perspectives of their students to believe, yes, they're going to be able to engage in inquiry, successfully. And we found that when they just went ahead and engaged in inquiry with students, and then they observed what happened with students and, sort of took a qualitative analysis approach and observed how successful students were and how their affect changed. The teachers, so sometimes it's on, learning together and developing that political consciousness and practicing it. But sometimes it's also just making the leap and then seeing what happens and then using that knowledge. And that, also was successful in making some shifts.
Thank you so much, Katie. Christine, I'm okay. I'm just looking at this. You have 2 more questions. I think it would be a good idea for them to go now because we're structuring this around people talking and then questions. And so the next talk, which will be Britain, will begin. We can handle another couple of questions quickly, I think.
Okay. Yes, so a lot of comments on how great this is and how important it is to look into the pragmatics of teaching and relationality and bringing that into these practices and whatnot. And then there's a question from Veronique. I'm wondering how you and your teachers conceptualize the contributions of students in reciprocal learning. Is this more than a shift in language or approach? What is the student expected to reciprocally contribute? And another question, a follow-up from Charlotte, who's saying, not a question, but she saying, I was really curious as to how within STEM, how this works within STEM. So, so I guess it's related, right? Like, is this more than a shift in language or approach? What's the student expected to reciprocally contribute?
Shaknoza, do you want to take that or do you want me to?
You can start and I can follow up. Or vice versa.
I mean, I think in terms of what the student is expected to contribute, I mean, I think we're really looking at this again, from that relational assemblage perspective, right? So it's a joint contribution. And one of the things that we've looked at, in another paper that Shaknoza and I have been writing is, reconfiguring power dynamics and really looking at one of the things we've looked at is how assets-based teacher moves play out at the moment-to-moment level, and looking at how they're coming into composition with students in ways that are legitimizing their linguistic, cultural, and everyday ways of knowing and being, and how that constitutes micro reconfigurations of power. And so, we've looked at how students, they take up positions that are offered to them. They create new, we're using actually positioning theory along with this to create new storylines. So it opens up opportunities for them to participate in different ways, in ways that are more meaningful and robust. So I think that it's an interaction, right? So there is that reciprocal piece in terms of when we're looking at pedagogy and learning. Shaknoza, do you want to add to that?
Yes, and I actually put it a little bit on the chat right before this, right? It connects to the first question about worldlings. This idea that the teachers and what was the biggest shift that we've seen with the teachers and the students working together on this, right? Number one, it wasn't about hierarchies, but the relationships were between the teachers and the students were more symmetrical, right? It was about, relational justice, and without a hierarchy of an adult and a child, or the binary of an adult and a child. And it actually connects to the idea of these worldlings that you mentioned earlier, that the teachers and students together in the context of STEM, they started to think about not about what is, but what might be, right? What might STEM look like in the future? What might communities look like in the future? What might their lives look like in the future? What might world look like in the future? It was about these worldlings. It was about these ontological definitions, redefinitions, and rethinking of what might be out there. It was more about the futuristic in terms of imagining and social dreaming. And it was so fascinating because at the end, we did one of the sessions this summer with the students and the teachers, and I had to let them know that this is probably the last summer I'm doing it, because I've been doing it for for 5 years. And then it was very interesting. The students came to me and they said, we only take up 2 weeks of your summer. Of course, they don't know what happens behind the scenes for that 2 weeks of the summer to happen. We only take up your 2 weeks of the summer. Why are you stopping this? Right? And then the teachers came to me and they said, Shaknoza, where can we find money so that we can continue for this? Because we don't want this social dreaming to end, right? So there was this idea of learning together, being together, and socially dream together, where STEM became a space for dreaming and worldling. And usually STEM is very pragmatic. We want to solve, we want to come up with solutions, we want to make sense of the world, right? It's less about how does it contribute to the betterment of the world, in where everyone and everything can actually thrive and flourish. We rarely talk about, in the context of the STEM, about these social dreams. So that was the shift that we've seen both in the teachers and the students.
We do have one more question, and then I think we need to move on to the next presenter. So we have a quick question from Dr. Joyce Mgombelo, who asks, thank you for the presentation. You touched a bit on the notion of intelligence as it relates to non-human beings. Could you elaborate more, especially in connection to social insects?
Social insects?
Yeah.
Do you want to take that?
I think I've got the question right, but maybe Christine can confirm, because we have 2 screens going on, and I can only see presenters, but not.
So the latest one, I think, and I have not done this research myself, but I went to a research talk at the MIT just because it's so close to me, and they were talking about intelligences of, for instance, ants, and looking at the the intelligences of the ants from a political perspective, how we can learn to do collective action from the swarming activities of the ants. And something that we then took up with the students and the teachers in the context of the STEM. So we looked at all kind of swarming that happens around us, right? And then a socialization and intelligence of the swarming, because swarming is such an intelligent phenomenon and can really help us to redefine what it means to do a collective action, which is again connected to the social dreaming. And I remember one instance where when we were working with the students about these ideas of what we can learn from swarming and intelligence of the social insects, the students said, if we want the administration to pay attention, we can all stomp our feet at the same time. The noise of, the collective noise will get their attention, if nothing. And I know that for adults, it may not seem, why should we care? For that moment, for the students who wanted the type of attention that they needed from the adults, right? That was a fascinating way of connecting what they were learning from intelligence of the swarming and social insects to the things that they can actually rethink in terms of the STEM and what happens in their classrooms.
Thank you so much to both of you. I'm going to move on now to Dr. Breton Varga and just do a very, very fast introduction. Breton is Assistant Professor of History, Social Science at California State University in Chico. His research works within critical posthuman theories of race, materiality, and temporality to explore how visual methods and aesthetics can be used to unveil historically marginalized perspectives and layers upon layers of history that haunt the world around us. His work can be found across a range of disciplines, including arts-based research, environmental studies, curriculum studies, social studies, and post-qualitative inquiry. Breton, thank you so much. It's great to see you again. Thank you so much as well to Katie and Shaknoza. And I'm going to hand over now to Breton. It's a real pleasure to be involved in this with you all right now. So Breton, over to you.
Okay.
Do you need to share a PowerPoint or can you manage that?
I think I can manage it, and once I get going, if you want to just give me the thumbs up, Fiona, that would be great.
I will immediately, as soon as I see it. Thank you.
Okay, so is that working for us? Can we see that?
It really is.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for the wonderful introduction, and it's great to see you as well, Fiona. I want to extend a warm thanks to you and Christine and the wonderful folks at the Posthuman Research Institute at Brock University for hosting this panel, for assembling it. It's truly an honor to be in community with you all and have the opportunity to share a couple of thoughts that, in full transparency, are weighing quite heavily on me and countless others here in the States. So I joined this virtual space from the traditional homelands of the Mechoopda people. The Mechoopda continue to be custodians of the beautiful lands and waters around the greater Chico area. Considering the context of my talk today, this land acknowledgement is of significant importance, as the very foundation of American society is built first and foremost on land theft, dispossession, and the genocide of indigenous peoples. And once the land was stolen, people were abducted and forced to work through chattel slavery, purloined landscapes, thus providing outcomes benefiting white bodies and positionalities. Now, this information is not new, and it's not my intention to merely retrace the obvious, although I would argue for many the oblivious nature of the historicities that underpin American life. However, my goal today is to further complexify and perhaps hazard these problematic coordinates through a framing that bridges materialism and affect. Here, via Deleuze and Guattari, and more recently Greg Seigworth, I'm drawing on Spinoza's conceptualization of affect as embodied, which complicates boundaries between feeling and movement through an accounting for points of contact, lines of variation, and fields of potentiality that perhaps can help us understand how the intensities of the world are encountered and re-articulated. As we move through this presentation, I invite you all to sit with and think with these registers. That is, the various intersections and movements between time, space, human and more than human bodies, the liminal texture of conscious knowing and subconscious feeling that is always already folding and unfolding, and the incalculable and perhaps unfulfilled possibilities and futures that await all encounters in the more than human world. Specifically, I'm interested in the dynamic relationship between three more than human entities: cotton plant, computer, and skateboard. Their entanglement with specific affective intensities, accordingly fear, suspicion, and joy, and the ways that both things and affects have been fundamental to reanimations of anti-Blackness within the context of American life and death. I recognize that two of these objects, obviously computer and skateboard, are human-made, whereas cotton is not. However, it is the thingification of the cotton plant that led to the development of the human creation, the plantation, that is of importance to the work that I wish to share with everyone this afternoon or evening, morning for me here in California. So I love this thought by Catherine McKittrick, which really nudges us closer to a material framing and speculative way of engaging with that which is violent, uninterrupted, and unspeakable. However, before we get too far down the material and affective path, I want to acknowledge that my attunement to my educator and scholarly positionalities is important to this work. These are nested and knotted within settler colonialism and structural racism and impact all aspects of my trafficking into the past, present, and future accounts of Black violence. Just as the framework of settler colonialism and thinking with Wolf here contains machinery that is always in motion and not simply a static epoch, it is my hope that my engagement with the things and the affects they produce for specific communities within that register of anti-Blackness will work towards a more intricate understanding of how, and perhaps why, senseless death continues to be enacted upon Black bodies time and time again. In particular, death that was underwritten by Black and white relationality to this plant shown here, the cotton plant, scientifically known as Gossypium. So by the year 1850, 1.8 million of the nation's 3.2 million enslaved people were growing and picking cotton. By 1860, enslaved labor produced over 2 billion pounds of cotton a year. Now, to get an idea of the economic wealth that was generated during this time period, in 1860, cotton was worth 10 cents a pound, but later skyrocketed to $1.89 a pound between 1863 and 1864. As we can see from this chart on the right side of the screen, there is an irrevocable relationship between time, space, and bodies. That is, the presence of cotton directly animated who was existing within the borders of the state of Mississippi. Both white and Black population increased dramatically in a manner that was co-constitutive with cotton production. However, what is not shown in these statistics in this chart is the effectual implications of all these upward statistical trends across production, populations, and price. Embedded within these relationships that are across those registers is an accumulation of feeling that directly intensifies both becomings and unbecomings. In this sense, perhaps thinking with, around, under, and through affects can be generative in understanding the different bodily relationships that both are at play and in play during this time period and beyond. As Sarah Ahmed reminds us, quote, "Emotionality as a claim about a subject or a collective is clearly dependent on relations of power, which endow others with meaning and value," end quote. Important to this thought is control and how those in power maintain the positionings necessary for dictating and manipulating affects. Oh, pardon my Google slide, it's a bit jumpy today. Okay, so to help us understand this relationship a little bit more between cotton and fear, I think Zakiya Iman Jackson's work on anti-Blackness, matter, and meaning is especially relevant. Jackson replaces notions of denied humanity and exclusion with bestialized humanization towards Black people. This argument abounds with opportunities for discourse on enslavement and animality, which I believe is generative in thinking about the roots of fear. Jackson's framing implicates temporality and opens up discursive inroads into how the cotton plant was used by white plantation owners to produce and reproduce sensibilities and embodiments of fear, which I would argue still leads to extreme violence enacted upon Black people. Returning to our chart, it is reasonable to suggest that these statistics are undergirded by a particularly insidious form of racial capitalism and exploitation, right? As plantations and populations grew, so too did white wealth. White plantation owners not only wanted to protect their investment, but also govern the way fear was embodied. Here, fear becomes kaleidoscopic, in so much that it is the afflicted and the encountered, or put into Deleuzian terms, fear becomes a, quote, a capacity to affect or be affected. As documented in writing by the slave codes from 1667 to 1880, whites inflicted fear upon slaves with brutal beatings, bestialized working and living conditions, and persistent surveillance through slave patrols. These patrols, which are the basis of modern-day American policing institutions, thrive off mapping fear onto Black bodies through terror and violence. In particular, and according to Gary Potter, these slave patrols had three primary functions. One, to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. Two, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And three, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside the law if they violated any of the plantation rules. Put simply, these patrols and countless laws that supported their violent tendencies, such as the Negro Act of 1740 passed in South Carolina, were composed to impose subjection and obedience and preserve the racial ordering of society, a society built around the emotional, physical, and financial well-being of white bodies. Going further, not only was this abhorrent governance legal, but the deployment of extreme violence to cultivate fear by enslavers was financially encouraged. Quoting the work of Leslie Alexander and Michelle Alexander here, quote, in many colonies like Virginia, the public treasury was even required to compensate enslavers if an enslaved person was killed while resisting or running away. Paradoxically, these productions occur as a result of an inverted register of white fear, fear of Black movement, fear of Black organization, Black worship, Black justice, Black resistance, Black hope, Black joy, and Black life. This form of fear has cast an indelible shadow on contemporary life and is still very much alive and well to this day. Who could forget Amy Cooper, a white woman who in 2022 called the police on Christian Cooper, a Black man who was simply bird watching in Central Park in New York City? Or the story of Lolade Siyobala, a Black graduate student in African studies at Yale, who after falling asleep while working on a series of papers was accosted by authorities when Sarah Brash, a white student, called the campus police to report a, quote, serious incident. While these are just two examples, Dr. Paul Butler, a Georgetown University law professor, reminds us that such instances happen so frequently to people of color that we don't often think of it as a big deal or being particularly newsworthy. As both instances were driven by fear and produced emotional trauma for the victims, sadly, there's another outcome, death, which is the result of another complex intensity, suspicion. Returning to Sarah Ahmed, feelings and emotions are sticky, and while always already in a state of becoming, I would add that they often get stuck onto other affects. That is, feeling begets more feeling. Thinking about affect in this way allows us to consider the pluriversality of feeling. Fear in this sense is not an effectual monolith, and it sticks itself to a range of other possible outcomes, ambivalence, avoidance, and back to suspicion. So zeroing in on this last register of suspicion, I want to overlay its tendrils onto another object, computer. On January 26, I received a beautiful invitation to participate on this panel. However, this email came on the same day as news was breaking that 3 Black police officers had been fired and charged with the second-degree murder of Tyree Nichols. Nichols was severely beaten on January 7th and died 3 days later. I want to be very careful here and not reduce this horrific murder to merely an opening of analysis, but rather attempt to bring in another material coordinate, computer, to help us continue to sit with and think about the problematic conditions that led to the tragic loss of Tyre Nichols' life and so many others prior. George Floyd, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin. As mentioned earlier, thinking through fear allows for a more entangled understanding of how policing is underwritten by white supremacist logic stemming from chattel slavery in America. Importantly, thinking materially about fear and racism also creates a line of flight that arcs towards and unveils acts and actions relating to the shape-shifting nature of white supremacy. Here I'm thinking about how technological advancements are saturated with racist machinations that are driven by suspicion. Framing technology through what Ruha Benjamin refers to as the new Jim Code allows us to account for the ways that computer and suspicion animated the actions resulting in Tyre Nichols' murder. The officers responsible for Tyre's death were part of the Scorpion Unit, a specialized police squad tasked with intimidating, harassing, and in this case, deploying lethal violence against citizens of Memphis, Tennessee. The movements of the Scorpion Unit are not happenstance, but rather highly intentional and informed by computer algorithms to spatially profile specific urban areas and make predictions of potential crimes. A closer look at the Memphis Police Department reveals the use of a computer algorithm developed in cooperation with the University of Memphis and two corporations, IBM and a local company called SkyCop. To summarize, the neighborhood in which Tyre Nichols was driving and eventually pulled over was under suspicion for violent criminal activity because of a racist algorithm processed by a computer, developed by an institution, and the policies and practices founded on fear and anti-Blackness. Despite many sources covering the murder dismissing the act as being non-racial, I would argue that the Black identities of the officers who beat Tyre Nichols to death are evidence of the complete permeance of both fear and suspicion within the architecture of police culture. Being Black does not make you immune to anti-Blackness, especially considering the underpinnings of organized policing and countless examples in America of Black life being deemed disposable. So where does this leave us? How do we advocate for substantial change? How do we talk to our students and teachers about these unspeakable and uninterrupted territories of violence? How might we dream otherwise? Perhaps when acts of violence do become visible, a nudge towards the material and effectual can be generative in helping students refuse historically censored, sustained, and whitewashed frames and forms of quotidian violence that drag our attention towards registers of inevitability and predictability. Here I'm thinking of what Stephanie Springate calls the imponderable extraordinary curriculum that refuses to accept a status quo approach to teaching, learning, pedagogy, and curriculum, and the ethico-onto-epistemological implications there within. As Jack Halberstam reminds us, acts of refusal, quote, may lead to forms of speculation, modes of thinking that ally not with rigor and order, but with inspiration and unpredictability. If we begin anywhere, we begin with the right to refuse what has been refused to us, end quote. Such approaches demand more questions and fewer answers. While I think grief certainly comes into play when thinking about these issues, I've learned through my own research on death and grief that we need to keep gratitude and joy in close proximity, for if we don't, we run the risk of being overwhelmed by sentiments of helplessness and hopelessness. As my social studies colleagues, Kristen Duncan, Dee Hall, and Damaris Dunn state, quote, if social studies is supposed to help students understand the full range of the human experience, the field's preoccupation with Black suffering must give way to curriculum and curricular materials that include a fuller picture of Black experiences, end quote. Duncan et al. Continue. Centering Black joy in social studies curriculum requires that teachers shift their mindsets about Black histories and communities, as well as what topics of study are worth dedicating classroom time toward. Most importantly, centering Black joy in social studies curriculum allows Black students to see their own humanity as they learn that their ancestors continually found joy alongside their struggle. As a closing pairing of materiality and affect, I want to conclude by tethering joy with and to skateboard. Tyree Nichols was a father who loved skateboarding. Although skateboarding culture has been shaped predominantly by white bodies, being a skater is inscribed with historical accounts of refusal against societal politeness and conformity, perhaps what Alexander Wahele calls a racialized assemblage. According to mostly skateboarding podcast host Patrick Hunter, every skateboarder has experienced some sort of frightening or traumatizing experience dealing with either police officers or security guards. I remember the first time I got lined up with a bunch of my friends for skating at a loading dock behind a photo studio. There's something bizarre about it in that we all knew what to do. You sit on your hands, you don't say anything, no one talks out of turn, and ideally they let you go. I've had friends who have been slammed into police cars, friends who have been arrested and detained. I've certainly been handcuffed. I've been stopped and frisked. Despite this struggle, Tyree Nichols found immense joy in skateboarding. In a tribute to his legacy, community organizer Aaron Wiggs spoke about how a deck of wood with metal trucks and rubber wheels covered in sticky tape holds the potential of leveraging personal joy into communal hope and action. The beauty of skateboarding is that you become allies with anyone who's on a skateboard. You can go anywhere in the world and meet someone with a skateboard and you become friends. Your sense of community is stronger, says Wiggs. In closing, my argument rests upon the position that thinking with things in affect can lead to a potentially more complicated and relational understanding of violent contexts through an accounting of how things become controlled in order to produce deliberate intensities that, more often than not, perpetuate and sustain ecologies of anti-Blackness. As we all continue to grapple with these thoughts in the context of a past, present, future world, shaped, misshaped, and reshaped by injustice, it is my sincerest hope that this presentation serves as a reminder that we must come to understand how present and future violence is predicated upon the problematic past of American society and institutional culture. Being attuned to affective saturations embedded within objects offers a slightly alternative angle for the realization that, as Sarah Ahmed has noted, as the human experience creates things, things in turn create the human experience. I find joy and hope in the words of Robin Kelley, author of Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, who noted that the relationship between refusal and liberation demands the mind's most critical creative capacities, catalyzed by participation in struggles for change. According to Elizabeth Clare Spalding and Dominique Adams, Damaris Dunn, and Bettina Love, this is the work that must be done to freedom dream. I leave you all with one last joyful coordinate. Remember Christian Cooper, the bird watcher from Central Park, who was forced to endure Amy Cooper's fear and suspicion? Well, he will be starring in his own show on National Geographic TV called The Extraordinary Birder, which will be released later this summer. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Breton. That was wonderful. I'm going to ask Christine Daigle to share any questions that are coming through the live stream chat. We certainly have at least 10 minutes for discussion before we run to Dr. Sidebottom. So, Christine, do you want to turn on your monitor, and I see a hand raised, and just offer the questions or put them in the chat?
Yes, I I will start with my own question, actually, while people gather their thoughts and put them in the chat, which I'm monitoring. But now, Breton, you mentioned, like this issue of, like, we need to discuss these issues. We need to bring them to the classroom. We need to have these very important, sensitive discussions. But sometimes I'm struggling for strategies, especially as a white lady. I mean, I've read Catherine McKittrick, Zakiya Jackson, and Ahmed and whatnot, but and also Butler's the book on I forget the title now, but the book on violence, The Force of Nonviolence, which I thought was very inspiring. And I struggle because of language, because of triggers, and so, I mean, what are good ways of introducing these topics when there are those identity issues? As a white woman, how do I speak about, not for? And do you see what I'm saying here? But I also don't want to leave it out of the classroom, because it is so essential to have those conversations.
Yeah, I thank you for the question, Christine. I think it's a really important point. And I would just say that with somebody with white, male, cis, hetero identities, you know, there is this uncomfortableness that is within this work. But at the same time, I think it is of the utmost importance that we continue to listen from and learn from folks who are having this lived experience and doing what we can to amplify the work that they're being done. You know, the scholars that you mentioned, Zakiya Iman Jackson, Sarah, those are scholars of color. And so I think this work leans heavily into the work that they're doing. And I had a conversation with Asalia Franklin Phipps. I don't know if she's on this call or whatnot. And we were talking yesterday, and we do not need more tools to talk about anti-Blackness. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. And I don't come into this space proclaiming to be, you know, proficient at thinking or discussing anti-Blackness. As much as it is, I think for all of us, we need to continue to sit with this uncomfortableness of how are these fields of violence continuing to occur, and what can we do about it? I think each person has to answer that question individually. In terms of teaching with your students, I think being vulnerable with your students and listening to your students and hearing their concerns, I think is a great place to start this conversation. But then also lean into the work of people who do have this lived experience to think beyond just the surface. And I think this is the work that I was trying to get across with the thoughts that I put together here today, is drawing upon scholarship that's already talking about these issues, more or less forming a nexus point for them to help me continue to think about why this continues to happen over and over and over and over again. And anytime there's a horrific murder, there's outrage in a lot of ways, and then it kind of simmers back down and it goes quiet. And what I'm interested in is not going quietly. I'm interested in continuing to talk about these issues until something happens. And just in full transparency, I'm grappling with everything, and I'm here to listen, and I'm here to learn from other people who have deep thoughts on these topics as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you said about, you know, being uncomfortable and making oneself vulnerable, I think also that coupled with an emphasis on relationality, I think might just be the key here to addressing those issues. Yes.
And I think also too, Christine, you know, there needs to be this acknowledgement. I think one of the first steps in disrupting racism and violence is naming it and calling it out. And I think within this context of policing institution, like, that is never something that's done. Are there good people who are putting their life on the line for the sake of all of us, protecting and serving? Like, of course there are. It's just like there are plenty of amazing teachers doing great work within this institution that is very whitewashed and very racist. I mean, we know curriculum through, I mean, we don't need to look far to know how, you know, problematic curriculum and a lot of pedagogies out there are. So I think multiple things can be true at the same time here. There can be good people who are part of police culture, but also we need to name it. We need to name that, you know, these institutions that are governing life for a lot of us are deeply racist and are deeply founded upon very problematic histories. And until that acknowledgement happens, you know, that's like step one. And until step one happens, we can't get to step two towards like reimagining or dreaming up something different that's going to be more conducive to this, you know, sustainability of all of our communities.
Breton, thank you so much. There are a couple of comments and questions in the chat that Christine has sent me. Thank you, Christine. The first comes from Charlotte. She says, I'm really interested to hear more about the embodiment of affect and inviting that embodiment into conversation with us. She says, not really a question as such. Do you have any further thoughts for the embodiment of affect?
Yeah, the embodiment of affect. So I think one of the reasons why I'm drawn to the concept of affect is because it is so nebulous. It's not this defined entity. It's not this defined thing that we can pick up and say, oh, I know what this is. I can put this to use. I think affect is a process, and I think it's an ongoingness. And when we think about this idea of embodiment, you know, I think Deleuze's thought is particularly important here of affecting and being affected. So how are bodies affecting others? And then within that, how are those bodies becoming affected? So where I'm at with my own scholarship on affect, I'm still working through ways. It's kind of like holding water. Some days I feel like I have a deeper understanding of what it's trying to get across. Other days it kind of goes right through my fingers. I would just encourage you to keep listening, keep reading, keep thinking about what does it mean to have this embodiment of intensities of the world, you know. And Greg Seidwerth's work, I think is of the utmost importance here in making these concepts that we can operationalize, you know, this idea of points of contact. What is occurring where these intensities are happening? Like, what is that moment? If we're walking down the street outside, like, what are those points of contact that are happening between bodies or more than human bodies that are producing intensities? And I think that's always a good place to start when we're thinking about what does it mean to be embodied, or what does this mean to have an embodiment of intensities? And then also, like, that point of contact is also occurring against all of these other relationships that are developing at the same time. So it's not just occurring within a vacuum, it's contextualized by the world and the way that the world is continually moving, folding, unfolding, as I was mentioning.
Thank you so much for that beautiful talk and the questions and comments. I'm going to just add one comment that's come from Donna Carlisle. It's not a question, it's a comment, and then we're going to move on to our last presenter. Donna says, such a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation, so much to absorb and very moving. I love how the materiality of the skateboard was affording a sense of community. So thank you for that comment. And thank you so much, Breton. I'm going to move now, because of time, I'm going to move now to Kay Sidebottom, who I've never met before, and who is a scholar I've certainly read and heard a great deal about. Kay has worked closely in the summers with Rosie Braidotti with her summer courses. Kay is lecturer in education and program director for a brand new MSc in education at the University of Stirling in Scotland. Kay's current research explores how teachers can work with posthuman ideas to facilitate meaningful and disruptive education spaces for our complex times. With a background in community and adult education, Kay's pedagogical specialisms include critical, radical, and an anarchist education, arts-based practices, and community philosophy. Kay, I'm going to hand over to you. And I just want to say how excited I am to see you. I've met Breton, I've met Katie, and so on. I haven't met you yet, but I can't wait to meet you in Scotland in May. So over to Kay, and thank you very much, everyone. We're going to have Kay for 20 minutes and then discussion for 20 minutes before we conclude at 2 p.m. Thank you, Kay. Over to you. If you have any trouble with if you have a PowerPoint, I can share for you if you have a problem with that.
I do, yeah. No, thanks so much, Fiona, and thanks for that really wonderful introduction. It's so lovely to be here with a group of people that I admire so much and to be part of this panel. So yeah, I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully it will work. I won't be able to see, so shout at me if you can't see this. But hopefully you can. Oh, hold on. So it looks good to me, so I'm going to make a start. So yeah, just wanted to say a couple of things before I begin about my journey and my relationship with posthumanism, just to put this into a little bit of context. So as Fiona mentioned, I first came to posthuman thinking back in 2015 when I first attended Rosie Braidotti's summer school in Utrecht. Didn't understand a thing, and I've been involved every year since, so getting towards my 8th year as being part of that in various capacities. And the big question that I came away with in that very first year was, I love this, but how can we put it to work? How can we actually put these amazing ideas, theories and concepts into practice in our everyday teaching, in our classrooms, you know, throughout the country in order to make some kind of a difference, and how to really enact it. And I've come back to that question every year. I've worked through it in different ways. Love the ideas that Shaknoza and Katie shared very much about the practicalities, because I think sometimes we can be bound up in some very dense theory that make it very hard for people to access. So what I'm going to talk about today is a project that took place last year. And it was very much about thinking how we can put critical posthumanism to work to get that kind of effective turn towards social justice that accounts for and also celebrates the difference between humans and their more than human counterparts. And very much thinking about Braidotti's idea of defamiliarizing. So how can we begin to defamiliarize ourselves from those dominant neoliberal visions of education, schooling and learning? So it requires very much that acceptance of the limitations of humanism that we've heard so much about already today, for taking account of the world and our relationship to it. It asks us to examine who and what's been critically left out or forcibly removed, as Breton explained, from the stories that we tell and the way that we enact education. So one of the things I really wanted to think about was this belief, I think, that I have and many of us share, that our current global predicament really calls for a way of thinking differently about our relationship with the world. So encouraging notions of kinship with non-human others, the complexities of that, reframing our attachment to that shared world. And when I say we, I'm kind of saying me, I guess, because of course, as Braidotti says, we're in this predicament together, but of course we're not one and the same. We all have different ways of being minoritized, oppressed, and so on. So I'm interested very much in the way that things like climate education are taught at the moment, and the way that we explore environmental education in our classrooms. And one of the issues that I think is really paramount is the way that, like everything, it's taught as knowledge, it's taught of accumulation of knowledge, but it isn't very often taught in a way that is effective, that draws on emotion, that draws on attunement, and that draws on feeling. It's very much learning about, it's individualized, you're assessed on it, and it takes place very often in disciplinary silos. It's learnt through science or it's learnt through geography. So I led from the quote here by Robin Wall Kimmerer: how can we expand our own vulnerability to experience this ecological compassion? What might we do to propel it? What might it look like? And how can we do this day to day through our pedagogy, which of course might feel quite far removed from all of this. So I'm going to talk about today three things really. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this idea of the great separation, the divide. Daniel Wildcat talks about this really poignantly, this great kind of gap that we have very often between ourselves due to these Cartesian dualisms, these binaries that make us feel somehow set apart from the natural world. And while doing that, how can we turn towards these minor understandings of how to be in the world? And when I say minor here, I'm talking about minoritarian in the Deleuzian sense. So that idea of bearing witness to the non-representative, to the non-discursive subjects, which have been excluded from those frameworks of history. So how can we reconnect with stories that we've forgotten to forget, our own folklore, our own connections to land, our own cultures, that isn't about appropriating the epistemologies of others? So thinking about indigenous epistemologies, for example, how can we start to turn towards our own stories and narratives? And of course, I'm coming from a UK context here with all the complexities and problems bound up within that. So this idea of ethical humility, really important within this project. And finally, I'm just going to talk through briefly the project itself. So what happened, what we did, what we learned, and what we continue to learn when we engage with teachers who are other than human. So thinking about this idea of defamiliarization, and Shaknoza talked about how hard it can be, I think, to get people in a place where we do defamiliarize ourselves from education as usual. And I think provocations, experiments, artistic practice are always a really good route in. So these are some of the questions that I might put to teachers when I'm thinking about how we might take a material turn. And I'm sure these will resonate with you very much, this idea of walking into a room and sensing an atmosphere. So this isn't the kind of thing that would be talked about or assessed in a teaching observation or an Ofsted grading if you're in England, but it's very much experienced all the time. We get that sense that something's happening, something's going on, even if we don't have language to it. How have you been affected in your teaching by smell, by temperature, by colour, sound, light, and so on? So all of these things that we know very much on a embodied level affects us, but again, very rarely brought to mind or kind of acknowledged as being significant in any way. And lastly, have you ever learned something important through relationships with animal companions? And that might be the animals that share your house, or it could be any kind of experiences that you have. It could even be the animals that kind of just form part of your daily working experiences, because of course they are always there in some capacity. So these kind of provocations, I think, help lead us in and start to make that effective turn to notice what else is going on. So posthumanism, as we know, it requires us to make a double move. And the first is going beyond or going after humanism as we begin to augment and reposition the voices of those who've been overlooked and oppressed by Enlightenment ideas of what humanity is. The second move is this one, it's post-anthropocentrism. And that's about the decentering of the human, the elevation of other species and ecological systems, which have always been relegated beneath man in an exploitative and limiting hierarchy. And it's impossible to separate these two moves out. And I think that's really important when we talk about posthumanism and posthuman thinking. So, for example, the way that climate change is absolutely entangled with colonialism. So it's not about taking these two things separately, and it requires us to think in very complex non-binary ways and make non-binary responses to the questions of our times. So as Jagodinski says here, you know, this idea of education being formed around the world being made for us in some way. We need to rethink what that means. We need to move to the symbiotic, as Ablett says here, symbiosis, decentering the human, bearing witness on all kinds of different levels, so from the personal to the global and back again. So I find the model here, the ecotistical worldview, so rather than an egocentric, moving to an ecocentric model, really helpful in that it's equalizing, it begins to decenter us. And as Lupinacci and Happel say here, in our kind of current thinking, and again, I'm talking very much about education in the West, and certainly this is how it feels in the UK at the moment, non-human beings are seen as inferior to animals. And we have this value hierarchy of living things. We've all seen the pyramid with humans at the top. And so these things are intrinsic in our systems. We very rarely even kind of notice. We need to bring that to our attention. So any reduction to a commodity is rationalized then based on this hierarchy. So these are the kind of ideas that I was really interested in exploring and talking to teachers about. And I have to say that this project emerged very much in the wake of lockdown. And of course, the pandemic forms the kind of backdrop, I think, to a lot of our thinking. At the moment, it's ongoing, you know, it's still very much part of daily life. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to think about was this resistance to an accelerated return to normality. So we have whatever normal means. We all know what happened when we started to lock down, obviously different for different people in different places. So things like we had goats appearing in the villages in Wales, the goose set up a nest in the middle of York railway station. And there'll be many other stories of how things started to blur a little bit for us. And we started to see, I think, that this big nature culture split, or you know, this great separation, as Wildcat would put it, is really a fiction. It takes very little to break down those divisions between the inside and the outside and to blur those boundaries. In England, schools were kind of treated very much as if they were hermetically sealed units. So the government insisted that there would be no transmission in these places. And evidence then showed, of course, that they were the places of most contagion. For a moment, when the planes and the traffic stopped, we could hear and see things that had otherwise gone unnoticed. But this rush, this acceleration to return to normal, which was never good in the first place, overcoded this noticing through massive practices of acceleration, reterritorialization, and recapture, of course, by capitalism. So thinking about this kind of led us to develop the project and start to think, okay, how can we begin to slow back down? How can we decelerate? So I wanted to say a couple of things about ethical humility, and this beautiful picture here by a friend of mine, Jodie Cloutier, again, was something that we looked at a lot, and we talked about a lot during the project. And I think one of the things that is really important to remember is, as Zoe Todd reminds us, many of the ideas that come up within post-human thinking are not new at all. They've been enacted, they've been inscribed as part of indigenous cosmologies for centuries. And while some notions of post-humanism continue to erase indigenous thought and practice, a post-humanism with an ethics of relational reciprocity calls us to account for and augment the voices of those silenced in preference of those from the overwhelmingly white male Western academy. So avoiding the co-opting of traditional worldly knowings as new discoveries or novel contributions to knowledge required us to bring in the voices of Indigenous scholars. One example of this is the notion of effective pedagogies, which is akin, or you might make akin to the idea of the learning spirit, which is spoken of by the Mi'kmaq First Nations people. So a long articulated belief and understanding of the world, nothing new about that. So this ethical imperative to turn to non-Western indigenous ontologies, not via a process of cognitive colonialism, but using ideas of ethical hesitation and humility, was really important. So accounting for different perspectives, as Braidotti says, we're in this together, of course, but we're not one and the same. And so an ongoing process of learning and reflecting. And this called us to think very much about our own relationships to land, which of course we all have. And I'm speaking very much from an English perspective here and from my own experience. But this is something that's very rarely talked about. We might see it through practices of storytelling occasionally, very much through music, very often through traditions and ceremonies and things like that that play out. But we don't often talk very much in great detail about our sense of belonging to land or what that means. So bringing those conversations right to the forefront. So a little bit about the project then. It took place in April last year. It was a research project, which of course had issues of its own, but it involved around 15 educators from a variety of teaching contexts. And I was keen to bring people together across educational silos. So we had teachers from schools, we had teachers from colleges, from higher education and from community education. And we went away, we took ourselves out of our usual settings and we went to a residential centre high up in Malham in the Yorkshire Dales in the UK. So this was situated, quite isolated place. It's high above Malham Cove, quite cut off from the outside world. And we had snow actually during the time we were there as well, which increased our kind of sense of distance actually. And what we did during that 3 days was we explored some art-based pedagogy, some experimental and creative pedagogical practices, working with and alongside fungi, water, moss and trees. We created artifacts, we took photographs and we reflected on those things together. So very much Katie and Johnny Lupinacci's words here, trying to learn together, to listen to the many wise voices we do not often hear, and certainly don't consider as our teachers, while sharing stories and engaging in critically examining our assumptions and the lessons we are learning. So the big question we asked ourselves was, what happens when you start to stop seeing humans as being the only educators? And I love that I've got ants in there because I think we mentioned ants right at the start of the session. So ants were very much there. We didn't have elephants, sadly, but I put them in because I like them and why not? So what did we learn from the project then? Really interesting. It was a very slow project. There was nothing formal particularly. We had a few things that people could get involved in and try if they wanted to. It was a very kind of fluid and quite relaxed experience. And of course, the kind of teachers that people were learning from, some of the pictures show you here. So very much thinking about mosses, thinking about relations, thinking about the lambs and the sheep and everything within the landscape. And also, interestingly, the material and non-naturalized aspects of our environment also played a key role in what we were learning from. So things like benches, dry stone walls, even the building that we were staying in also formed an important part of that decentering. So the world is full of persons and only some of whom are human. One of the things I think it's important to note is that what we didn't want to do was create some kind of utopia. So to go away to the Yorkshire Dales is a privilege actually for many people who don't have access to that space. And in England, you know, people don't have access to space very often, huge issues in terms of who is allowed to be mobile, where people can walk and so on. And the Yorkshire Dales themselves are quite problematic spaces. They're overgrazed, deforested, gentrified very often. Only 5% of the landscape of the Yorkshire Dales is woodland now. It's very difficult to access if you don't have a car and so on. So I think one of the things that came up as part of this project was the importance of critique, an affirmative critique, critically positioning ourselves within this kind of cartography that we were forming, and not seeing it purely as a break from the norm. How can we do this not by going away, but by being where we are, was actually a really important thing to talk about. A couple of things about the research methodology, and I really resisted this idea of the project being research, but of course I've been given money to do it, so it took me back to that linearity of outcomes and outputs and all of those kind of things. But we did problematize it together, what counts as research. And one of the things that we did as part of the project was we expanded our ethical approval to include naturalized others. So to give you an example of this, we used walking methodologies. We were thinking about walking interviews on the work of Aaron Kuntz in particular, but thinking about when we do that, who are we also including and needing to be ethically accountable for? So the way in which we were walking but being interrupted by the sound of the wind or the noise of the water. So people very much imbricated in those discussions and taking our conversations in many different directions. So as the quote says here, we're talking together, thinking about more than human teachers and what they meant to us. Oh, look, that tree's uprooted and there's some fungus over there. So what does it mean for these breaks to happen? What are they producing in terms of the way we're finding out and answering the questions that we're posing ourselves? So walking art-based methodologies were kind of really key to this, and also this idea of a slow ontology. So the way in which we didn't want to kind of start and end the research and have some kind of break in that process. So the project is ongoing, it continues to emerge. People could do whatever they wanted with it, they could take it into their own practice. So all of these kind of minor resistances again back against research as normal. So there's a few quotes here. This is, again, responding to that question about what have we learned, what could we learn if we decenter humans as teachers. And I won't read through all of these now. I'll share a link with you at the end if you want to find out more about it. But I just wanted to share the one in the top right because it kind of led very much into our conclusions about this. It makes me think of possibility and that things can be different horizons. It makes me feel a kind of yearning when I think about the phrase and embodying. It connects to something I can't quite articulate, but it feels like a kind of journey towards, even if we don't ever get there in our lifetime. And it connects to something quite spiritual, something I feel right in the center, almost in my stomach. And I think when I think back to the start of the presentation and thinking about how we learn differently about our relationships with the world, that idea of yearning, that idea of surrender, how we articulate that, how we kind of begin to notice that, feels very key, but also feels like a massive challenge to the current education systems that we're in. So together we came up with some ideas then about how these post-human pedagogies might enact in practice, so the kind of things that perhaps we need to think about. And the first one was just very much that process of noticing, just stopping, pausing, giving ourselves the chance to feel, to see, to experience something differently. You can be taught by the absence of something. So these are quotes from the things that people said. Secondly, that idea of attuning and surrendering. So having to give something up. And of course, there's pain that often goes along with that. So that's important to think about. You know, if we're managing this process, we're facilitating, we're acting as guardians, what do we do with that? How do we support that? How do we facilitate it? It makes me feel a kind of yearning. The importance of deceleration and slowness. So taking time that we don't have, of course, within the day-to-day curriculum, the school bell and all of that kind of thing. There's all of this and more on this blue sky that's kind of there looking on, that's going to outlive and outlast any of this institutional life. really important one here that we found during our weekend away. And it was actually not so much decentering, but also recentering ourselves as relational beings. So when we were looking at things like fungi, when we were looking at things like mosses, when we were looking at water, we remembered, just as Katie mentioned right at the start, the importance of relationality, the fact that we are interacting with things all the time, that we are constantly in relation. And as much as we were decentering and looking to others as teachers, we were realizing together how much we needed to recenter ourselves in that sense of being relational, being reciprocal. So the knowledge that we generated together, of course, is bigger than any one of us. And lastly, the importance of critique and affirmation. So being able to say, yes, we have this position, this is the issue with this particular landscape, to be constantly putting things into question and seeing the bigger picture, but in a spirit of ethical affirmation, as Braidotti would say. So having this idea of affirmative ethics that is very much about, as Breton was talking, finding joy as well. So joy is a productive force. And of course, as Haraway puts it, staying with the trouble. So not turning away from it, but very much putting ourselves back in the centre. So just to sum up briefly, in terms of this idea of post-human pedagogy is very much about shifting our relationships with the natural world, bringing together different epistemologies, but in the spirit of very much humility there, and teaching using this filthy lesson of symbiosis. So it's messy, it's complex, it's dirty, it's uncertain, it requires vulnerability. I'm going to pop the link to the Padlet in the chat if people want to follow up the project and read a little bit more about it. Loads of references, loads of reading to share as well, so people can contact me if they want any of those things. And yes, very open to questions, chatting about it now or afterwards with people if they want to do that too.
Kay, thank you so much for that beautiful talk. You certainly raised for me the idea of moments of intensities that Breton spoke about, you know, violence, sadness, fear, joy, and grief. And certainly the idea that these affects are shared by humans, non-humans, in spaces and places, and so on. In fact, you really attuned me to the idea of the lives of non-humans, including plants. There's a really beautiful there are a couple of beautiful comments here that I'm going to share with you. First, I'm going to begin with Su-Ming Ku, who says, as a never indigenous person, a large proportion of people in the world, I sometimes say endogenous as an alternative to indigenous. Start from where you are without having to appropriate a perspective from elsewhere or from others. So just if you, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I thought that was a rather lovely comment, especially in relation to the artwork you shared with us.
Yeah, thank you. And it's something that we talked about a lot. We struggled with, as I say, we drew on lots of different Indigenous scholars, and I think it's something, say, particularly coming from this position, being in England and having all these really complex issues and entanglements and histories, you know, really awful histories that, of course, we're never taught about. We don't learn about these things in our history classrooms. So that's one of the conversations that we had. You know, how can we bring those conversations back in, very much in relation to Breton's talk from, you know, the Indigenous perspective of things, but also this idea of two-eyed seeing, which is talked about a lot, you know, bringing these things together, I think, as well, and the productive and the generative, affirmative nature of that.
Thank you so much, Kay. And there's another comment from Donna Carlisle. She says, that was so wonderful. The idea of defamiliarization is so critical for supporting social justice and disrupting power in education. Thank you so much for this, the beauty of yearning as a fabulous catalyst to regain our rhythms with nature. And certainly those images of birdsong during COVID dystopia were, you know, the images of animals and other beings occupying spaces previously disallowed. And you also spoke about access to space. And certainly I think by extension, we could think about access to things and access to feelings and so on. I wonder if there are any other comments or questions for Kay. I'm just looking. Christine, you've got, is this a legacy hand up? I think it is.
No, this is a question from me, actually. I was wondering, you know, when you were discussing ethical humility and also, of course, epistemic humility, right? What if what we can learn from our interaction with the non-human or the more than human, what if what we can learn is that sometimes there's something that is going to be outside of our reach? I've had this wonderful experience of collaborating with a bee. A bee had a project. I still don't know what the project was, but I did collaborate, and I had to accept that I would not ever understand what this was about. And so what do you think of this idea that this humility is also about recognizing our limits and the some of the fundamental differences that we're faced with, or the incommunicable sometimes in those experiences and collaborations? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things very much that came out of the weekend, the fact that there is so much we don't know, and to kind of think about that within education, where teachers are still held up as being the font of all knowledge, and you still have the teacher at the front of the room and all of this kind of thing. You know, there's a real challenge, I think, in that. That's part, again, of that defamiliarization, to kind of let go a little bit and say, yes, we don't know about this. One of the things that was beautiful about it, again, as well as kind of turning to the non-human and exploring and witnessing, bearing witness, actually just sitting and bearing witness, as you did with the bee, Christine, you know, just actually, I'm just going to sit here and just be present. Actually, I don't need to understand it, don't need to explain it. It just is. I think as well as that was the beauty of kind of learning from each other. So although we might not have had much knowledge, or we didn't know about one thing, you know, other people did, and they had stories to tell. Again, so bringing back that idea of relationality between us, as well as between, you know, the world that we're experiencing and that we were being part of. And it was one of the big surprises for me of the project, because I think you always go into these things, and again, that's a defamiliarizing process with some anticipation of outcome, don't you? When you're doing any kind of research, you've got, even though you might not want to admit it, you've got an idea of what's going to come up. And that was one of the things that surprised me hugely, just how important it was for people to be together, actually. And that's, again, coming on the back of lockdown, the first time that people were able to do that, but to do it in a space where there was no timetable, actually, there was no plan. Let's just see what happens here, but let's just be together and do that. And that was a really, yeah, a surprising but a really lovely thing. And then, of course, we related that back to what we were seeing around us and how nature was kind of doing that same thing, if you know what I mean.
Thank you so much, Kay. I'm just going to look back at the chat. Okay, Veronique asks, could you speak a bit more on ecotistical worldview, especially about the ways you and your participant engaged with transforming one's worldview?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I say, that diagram, I think one of the things I wanted to do kind of at the start of the weekend, and I was in that slightly tricky position of facilitating something, again, that I had quite a fixed idea about, even though I tried to resist that. and also letting things emerge. But also I didn't want to bring people together without explaining a little bit about where I was coming from in order to foreground it. So again, you know, not anticipating resistance, but anticipating bewilderment, perhaps, but bewilderment can be a good thing, of course. So that ecotistical worldview model was really helpful in terms of thinking, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting, because we're used to the pyramids, we're used to straight lines and linearity and all of this progression. What happens if we start to see it as interrelated and a web, you know, a system, a complex system? So that was really helpful, I think, in terms of setting the scene a little bit for people. And yeah, what was the second part? Just remind me, Fiona, the second part of the question. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
So sorry, I turned off my volume because my pug is clattering on the floor here. So sorry about that, I forgot. Could you speak a bit more on ecotistical worldview, especially the ways you and your participant engaged with transforming one's worldview? And then there's also another question for you, Kay.
Okay, yeah, no, perfect. So how we sort of set about transforming it, we were very much spending time, obviously we were outside quite a lot, but we were also using artistic practices, and that really helped us, I think, in terms of getting a route into thinking differently. So I'm not an artist in any sense, I'm really not very creative, but other people were, which was brilliant. So we spent time kind of constructing things. We were drawing, we were photographing, but we were also writing poetry, which again is something that I think very often takes us to that effective place, starts us to, you know, we want to kind of turn away from language to a certain degree, but also there's beauty in that, and that's often a way in. So we used the words from Ursula Le Guin, some of her poetry. We looked at some Indigenous poetry, and again, that was something that helped us attune. So it was all about that attunement. And then just going out and starting to notice. So particularly fungi was of interest to us, and we were lucky enough to have someone who knew a little bit about it, so they were able to explain about rhizomes and how trees communicate and all of that, and then we'd go and look at those things for ourselves. So it's very much about coming close, I think, to the action, experiencing it, and doing that through all kinds of different routes, the things that kind of hit us right in the heart, really.
Okay, thank you so much. If we could hold this space for a couple more minutes. There is another question / comment. Are you okay if I share this with you?
Sure.
Thank you to everybody for being with us. This is one more here, and David Fancy says thank you very much as well. Oh gosh, there are quite a few. All right, so just very quickly, Charlotte says, often the call for participants or applicants to take part in research leaves some excluded. How do we challenge this further to expand and include more?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a brilliant question, Charlotte. Thank you. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I found with this project, one of the things I didn't want to do was to kind of limit applications, but of course you're always bounding things. So I put things out on social media and all of that kind of thing. We tried to create, and Katie, it's a shame Katie's not still here, because Katie's very big on ethical practices in terms of things like research scholarship and publication and all of that kind of thing. What we tried to do with our call for participants was also to enact an ethical process around that, which I can talk about more. I won't at the moment, but it was very much about saying, connecting to values. So rather than saying, oh, do you have these criteria? Do you have these particular qualities? It was saying, what are your values around these kind of things? And the second part of it was around this idea of minoritized and being minoritarian in some way. So what we asked for in this call was, you know, about difference. What is it about you that kind of relates to this idea of kind of affirmative differences that will lend you, you know, to come to this project. So lots probably more to say about that, but I think that's such a big question and such an important one, something that I was very mindful of.
There is another comment, question, which is also, I think you'll also find very good. It's from Kirsten Somerville. I'd love to hear more about the process of incorporating the non-human into the ethical approval process. How did you navigate extending ethical principles beyond the human within institutional structures that may not be designed for this?
That's another great question. Yeah, I love that. With great difficulty, but I put it into my ethics form. So of course ethics is ridiculous with projects, isn't it? Because you have to get your ethics approved at the start and then it's almost kind of forgotten about, whereas it should be an ongoing ethical process all the way through. So when I applied for ethics, I had that consideration in there that there will be non-human participants, and actually how we were going to be mindful of that. And one of the ways that we did it was thinking through our own ideas of kind of land acknowledgements, reciprocity in terms of what we were giving back during the projects, reciprocity in terms of what we were acknowledging and how we were acknowledging those kind of non-human, more than human participants, and also how we were giving thanks at the end and how we were affirming that space. And that was a really powerful kind of process. And again, we didn't want to kind of appropriate, you know, kind of Indigenous land acknowledgements. We didn't want to do that particularly. So we were thinking about different ways in which we could hold that recognition, what we might do, but also what we might continue to do in future in other spaces and in other projects like this. So yeah, I think I shocked a few people possibly with the institutional ethics form, but anyway, got to be done.
There are lots of comments here in the chat. Okay, I don't know if you can see them, but lots of people thanking you and thanking Breton and everyone who's spoken today. We are now at 2:02. I don't know if you or Breton have a final comment to make before we close down, or if Christine wants to say something. I just want to thank everyone for being with us, holding space together this afternoon, this evening, or this morning, wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much to people who've commented and asked questions, and of course to our presenters. Does anyone have any further comment? Christine, did you want to say anything as Director of PRI?
I didn't have a plan to, but there I am. Just wanted to thank the speakers and you, Fiona, as Associate Director of the PRI. This was a wonderful discussion, very rich themes and topics. So I'm very appreciative that folks came to share their thoughts and research with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. And I'm very sorry that this conversation, that the time has run out. I'm sure there's a lot more that we could say. Very moving conversations, which is what you want more of in academia. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Breton. Thank you, people who participated.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now.
Great to see you, Fiona. And
great to meet you.
Can't wait.